Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Magdi Hanna. I will be the host for this webinar hosted by the International Institute for Software Testing. We're very pleased to have with us today for this webinar Lee Barnes, who is the CTO of Utopia Solutions. The webinar is on the subject of effective test automation in DevOps, moving towards continuous testing. This webinar is one of a series of webinars hosted by the International Institute for Software Testing. You can always look at future webinars at the IIST website, testinginstitute.com. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be available at the IIST website sometime next week. I want to thank all of you for joining us in this webinar, and I will now give the webinar to our speaker, Lee Barnes. Lee?
Thanks so much, Magdi, for having me, and really happy to be here. For everyone listening, please enter your questions in the question chat, and we'll monitor them and answer as many as we can at the end. And if we don't get to them, we will certainly follow up via email with each question personally. So let's get started. I'm going to be talking about techniques for effective test automation in DevOps today. And personally for me, and maybe for many of you attending, I come from a background where test automation meant automating huge regression test suites that were executed at the end of long development cycles. And I think, unfortunately, if you go out in the world and still today and try to learn about test automation, a lot of that information you're going to find was born out of that mindset. And many of it, I think, actually came from commercial tool vendors going back over 20, 25 years. And there's a lot of problems with that approach, but what's relevant to us today is that legacy approach to test automation is absolutely going to be counterproductive to what we're trying to do with DevOps. So we'll be talking about how we can approach automation in a way that's much better aligned with DevOps. And I should say that none of the techniques we're going to talk about necessarily are specific to DevOps. It's just that the agile, more iterative, quicker development cycles that are prevalent in DevOps surface a lot of these issues much more quickly, and they can't be hidden or masked by the long release cycles that we had with more waterfall approaches. So before we get started, very briefly, as Magdi said, I'm CTO of Utopia Solutions. We're a QA testing focused service provider. Personally, I've been involved in QA and testing for over 25 years now, with most of that time focused on implementing test automation. And certainly while my thoughts and approaches have evolved over the years, I think one thing that's been continuous is a passion about helping folks implement automation the right way. And what's important about that is that right for one person or one organization is not what's right for the other. So it's really about more generally applying automation techniques to solve testing problems. So briefly, agenda, we'll have a short intro on the importance of testing and test automation in DevOps. Spend a bit of time talking about some of the anti-patterns that we can fall into. Again, much of that was coming out of the legacy approach that I mentioned. And then we'll focus the rest of the time, most of the time, on what I call the 3 pillars of effective test automation, which are scope, approach, and then test environment and data management. And we're going to, again, talk about these practices in the context of DevOps and how they're going to move us toward continuous testing, but certainly applicable to test automation in general. All right, so let's talk briefly about the role of testing in DevOps. The goal behind DevOps is to reduce your development cycles and more frequently release high quality software that hopefully is aligned with business objectives. And we certainly could start a religious debate about what DevOps is and means, but in generally, that's what most organizations are striving for. So in DevOps, testing is moving from being part of the development cycle to something that is done throughout the cycle. And in order to accomplish what we need in DevOps, our testing activities need to give us fast, accurate, and actionable feedback. We can't be waiting for long, slow tests to run and then have to sift through piles of results to understand if our build's ready to move down the pipeline. We certainly can't be wasting our time chasing down false positives or worse, false negatives. And I have a longer version of this talk where I go into a deeper discussion about testing specifically in DevOps. While it's out of scope for today, I do want to bring up one important point about quality and testing in a DevOps environment. And that is that I often see a common symptom for organizations moving to DevOps where quality is supposedly becoming everyone's responsibility. But a common problem when something becomes everyone's responsibility is that it can often become no one's responsibility, right? Someone is thinking, well, it's no longer my specific role to do this. It's everyone's role, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. So before you start down that road of test automation, that's a concept, a part of the DevOps culture that you really need to embrace. That, you know, the old waterfall days when there was a test automation engineer or a team of automation engineers that maybe served multiple long waterfall cycles or projects, that model, as we'll see, just doesn't fit into a DevOps environment. So if we understand that testing has to provide fast, actionable, accurate feedback, in general, let's look at the importance of test automation specifically in DevOps. And I think a good way to do that is to look at the description of continuous integration capabilities from the DevOps handbook, which I can highly recommend, by the way, for anyone looking to get an understanding of what DevOps is truly from a culture and a process perspective. So I've highlighted the important ones with respect to automation. The first point tells us that we have to have a comprehensive and reliable set of automated tests. And the next point goes on to say that we need to have a culture that stops our entire pipeline when those tests fail. And this, of course, really speaks to the importance of those tests being reliable. If we're going to pull the emergency brake on our software delivery because some automated tests failed, we better be able to count on them. And we'll talk about that more later. So I think another way to look at the importance of test automation is to look at the level of automation across different categories of DevOps performers. This data is from DORA's 2018 State of DevOps report that shows the level of manual work across different categories of DevOps activities, including testing. And as you can see, the high and elite performers have quite a bit of test automation as well as other automated activity compared to the lower performing counterparts. So it's a good indication of the importance of, if you want to be successful with DevOps, you need to be successful with test automation. So great. What's the big deal? I need successful test automation. I've got tests. I just need to automate them. I need a framework. I need a tool. I need to install it and get it implemented and get some training, and I'm done. But the reality is there's some very alarming statistics that go along with test automation. If we look at, again, the World Quality Report that states the level of test automation is below 20%. And the context of that statement is really, of all the things that could be automated with respect to testing, only 20% of them are. And similarly, it goes on to say that the value generated by test automation is remaining largely unchanged. So even if as we pour more and more resources, effort, and money into test automation, we're not really getting anything more to show for it. So there's got to be some underlying issues that we'll need to look at. And I think probably the most alarming statistic, and I couldn't find a reputable source, but I think if you talk among some of the industry leaders, it's pretty commonly accepted, and that's that almost 80% of test automation implementations fail. And I'm not necessarily referring to huge, put the effort on the shelf type failures, but if we look at our desired results at the outset of implementing automation, and then where we actually got, it's a high percentage of us are not achieving them, those anywhere near those results that we intended. So before we get into some of the common obstacles to test automation success in general, and of course specific to DevOps, I want to talk about a very common misconception of what test automation really is. I think first, if we look at this definition of testing, and certainly you may have a better one, but bear with me for a minute. We see terms like knowledge, experience, critical thinking, designing experiments. And we have to ask ourselves, is this really what we automate when we say test automation? And I think we can probably all answer no, of course not. Clearly that's not what's being automated. And if you spend any time in the software testing space and specifically doing some reading on test automation, you'll see that there's a relatively new movement to get away from saying test automation and replace it with automation in testing. And I think that makes it, it may be semantics, but I think it makes it more clear that what we're doing here is applying automation principles to testing activities. And I've been in this space for so long, I have a hard time not saying test automation, but every time I do say automation and testing, it gives pause, and I think it opens up the conversation to a more broader discussion about what automation is. It's just not automating manual test cases. So I think very clearly we're not automating the testing. So as we talk about test automation for the remainder of this session, don't want to think of test automation as a replacement or a different way of doing your testing. Rather, just think of it as simply making certain activities that you perform as part of testing more efficient and more effective. All right, so if we agree that we can't be successful with DevOps without effective test automation, I think we need to understand what some of the common obstacles are that are really leading to some of those alarming statistics that we just talked about. So first is too much or even not enough automation. I see a lot of instances where there are many automated tests, but they were created just because they could be automated, and really that's not enough justification. You'll see organizations that are very proud to say they run thousands of tests every day, but this is definitely a quality over quantity situation. And as we talk about DevOps pipelines in a minute, I think you'll see why. I also see, and less frequently certainly, not enough automation where there's been an investment in implementing tools and processes and frameworks, but there's just not enough coverage for whatever reason, and it really is not making any impacts at all on your efficiency. Second is automating the wrong tests, and these are tests that aren't providing value or tests that can't be reliably automated, and that just becomes a huge waste of time and effort. And we'll spend some time talking about how to identify what the right tests are in a bit. Next, and I think this is a huge one, focusing only on UI tests. Why that is, I think, because a lot of us, when we started in automation, there was only UI level tools available, and that was our hammer, and every automation problem we saw became a nail to us, and we grew comfortable with that. But the reality is, even if you're doing everything right, these are the slowest, most unreliable automated tests there is. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any. We should certainly validate the mechanics of our user interface. But I'm saying is, if 100% of your tests are at the UI level, especially if there's a service or API layer available, that's likely going to be a problem. Next, and certainly as we'll talk about quite a bit, this is one of the top offenders in not having stable test environments or data to execute on. Finally, not treating automation as code. And I'm not going to really go into this, but let's suffice it to say that if we're going to rely on our automated test, at least in part to assess the quality of our product, we need to treat that code that those tests are built on with at least the same care that we give the application that we're testing. I should mention before we go on as well that an important part of DevOps, especially the culture aspect, is continuous improvement. And forgetting to continuously improve or apply that same culture and thought process to your automation is another common obstacle. A lot of organizations treat test automation as a fire and forget solution. I've built my test suite, I'm going to execute it, as often as I can, but thinking about how that can be improved and improve the value that it provides sometimes gets left out. So we've talked about the obstacles to test automation. So let's take a look now at what effective test automation looks like. And I found, like I said, that the 3 pillars or attributes of effective test automation are scope, approach, or really the method used to implement automation, and environment and data. Let's talk about scope and approach together, because I believe they go hand in hand here over the next few slides. So before we get into a detailed conversation about test automation scope, let's look at some of the trade-offs that we encounter in a DevOps pipeline. As we go further down the pipeline, at least hopefully, we have an increased confidence in a build's readiness for deployment to production. And typically, those environments are becoming more production-like. The trade-off is that as tests and environments become more complex, the time it takes for those tests to give us feedback increases. So we have this constant battle between risk assessment and coverage, test coverage, and the desire to get fast feedback and move quickly through the pipeline. So as we'll see, this really highlights the need to think very critically about, first of all, the types of test suites we create and add to our pipeline, and then specifically within those test suites, what tests that we add to them, and of course, how we create them. So first, let's talk about how we can assess the test suites or the types of test suites we may need in our pipeline. I think a good way to do that is to use a process that was introduced by Katrina Clokey and further refined by Ashley Hunsberger in a talk she gave, I believe it was SauceCon a handful of years ago. And that's the test suite canvas. The idea behind the test suite canvas is to think about important aspects of the test suite so we can, first of all, determine if we need it at all, and then secondly, figure out what it's going to do and how we're going to implement it. And this needs to be a group exercise, right? I talked about testing and quality being everyone's responsibility. So often I see automation implemented by an automation engineer that may be part of the organization, maybe in a different group, but it's their sole responsibility to figure all this out with really not a whole lot of input or help or assistance from the rest of the organization. But this exercise needs to be a group activity. And why? Because it gets everyone thinking about the details associated with each test suite, right? It's easy to say, hey, we need an API integration test or an end-to-end test suite, and not really think about all the details of what that means, how that fits into our pipeline, what needs to be in place to be successful. So let's just quickly go through the different areas of the canvas. Well, first is purpose, right? If you can't define a purpose for a test suite, you probably shouldn't be including it into your pipeline. I think that's fairly obvious. Dependencies, though, are a big issue. So what systems, what tools, what other things need to be in place for us to execute this test suite appropriately? Constraints as well, and this is a big one. What is standing in our way? What obstacles do we have that are preventing us from implementing this test suite in the way we need to implement it? Because we are in a DevOps environment, pipeline and execution are very important. Will it be part of the pipeline? Where will it be in the pipeline? When will it be triggered? How often will it be triggered? We should think about all these things up front, not after we've built the test suite and then try to fit it in appropriately. As you mentioned earlier, environment and data are huge. what environment is the test suite going to run in, and how we're going to manage data. And we'll talk in great detail about some techniques and issues associated with that in a bit. Of course, ownership and response, and I'm not just talking about ownership from a figurehead perspective, but who's going to respond to issues if the test suite finds them, or if the test suite itself has issues. Maintainability is always a big discussion point for automated test suites, but not just how are we going to maintain it in response to application changes, but what if we have to hand over ownership or some roles associated with it to someone else? What needs to be in place so we can do that as effectively and as efficiently as possible? And finally, the effectiveness. And this is really a metrics discussion, right? How do we know, we created this test suite for some reason, we're maintaining it for some reason. How do we know that we're still getting the value that we need from it? Because it is perfectly fine for a test suite that might have had appropriate value, maybe at the beginning of an organization's development of an application or transition to DevOps, and it becomes less important over time, and maybe other types of testing become more important. So that's something, and again, that's part of the continuous improvement side of DevOps. So, and I'll also say this whole process does a real good job of avoiding a common test automation anti-pattern, and that's creating a catch-all test suite that is typically targeted for a downstream environment like staging or something similar, and it serves as a substitute for all the testing and test automation you should have been doing upstream. And I think this is kind of again a carryover from the waterfall approach, legacy approach to test automation. But by getting everyone in the same room and thinking about all of the different testing activities throughout the pipeline, we can just completely avoid that temptation, if you will, of just creating one catch-all test suite, kind of end of cycle test suite. So once we've gone through this process for all the test suites we think we may need, what we'll do typically is take each canvas and transform them into a single spreadsheet, one row per test suite, so we can easily see the universe of testing activities that we've mapped out for our pipeline. Can help us identify common constraints or dependencies that we need to take care of, where if we can knock out those obstacles, we can clear the road for multiple test suites. And once you have an idea of the test suites that you need, it's a good exercise to map those out across your pipeline so you can visualize the flow of the build with respect to your risk assessments. And this also helps us understand if certain test suites must be run in series, or can they be run in parallel, for example. So we talked about how we can identify which test suites are important. Let's look at how we might be able to evaluate if a test is worthy of being part of a test suite. If your automated tests are going to be part of a continuous testing environment, then they need to be ready to run pretty much on demand. And as we already discussed, they need to be fast, accurate, and actionable in terms of the feedback that they provide. So a test automation engineer out of the Netherlands, Bas Dijkstra, has come up with a great acronym for reminding us about the qualities to look for when we are trying to discern if our automated tests are fit for continuous testing. And that's FITR. It stands for focused, informative, trustworthy, and repeatable. Let's talk about focused first. And this really refers to testing functionality as close as you possibly can to where it's implemented. For example, let's say the purpose of your test is to test a tax calculation that's performed by an API. And let's also say that you create a test that attempts to do that by checking the value in an invoice total field on the user interface. And maybe not a great test, but bear with me. And now let's say we find an issue with that test. The total invoice value isn't what we expected. It could be because the API has an issue, or it could be one of many other things. The point is we've set ourselves up for a long investigation in trying to determine why that test failed. Whereas if we had executed that directly against the API, we would know probably exactly why the test failed, or at least exactly, we would know with high confidence that it was the tax API itself is where the problem lies. Next is informative. And I think first, if your tests are focused, that certainly goes a long way to helping them be informative, but we can do more. For the test itself, it should be as self-documenting as possible. Someone looking at the code or the implementation of the test, wherever that is, should be able to understand its intent. And probably more importantly, the output, so the logging and the reporting, should provide you feedback as to what happened, especially if an issue is encountered. Because that's where we spend most of our time, trying to understand why tests failed. Was it an application issue? Was it a test suite issue? Was it an environment issue? So for example, if a test encountered an issue because it couldn't locate a UI object, I don't want to see a stack trace. If I'm the automation engineer, that's probably fine. But if I'm not, and very often that's not the case in terms of who's reviewing the results, I would want to see, what field I was trying to identify, what specific locator I was using to find it, and a screenshot. And that probably gives me enough information to understand why that test failed. Next is trustworthy, and this is a big one. Again, if we're going to be part of the build pipeline and part of your culture is to stop the process if an issue is encountered, your tests have to be trusted. If they can't be trusted, then they're going to lose the privilege of being part of the pipeline, or the results are just going to be ignored, and really that's, we've diminished all value at that point, either way. And finally, they need to be repeatable. If your tests are going to be kicked off automatically by some event that we're not controlling, they need to be ready to go. And this usually means that we've taken care of business with respect to test environment and data management, and we're going to talk about that here next. So again, if we look at last year's World Quality Report, we see that test environment data availability are the top challenges to successful test automation. And this has been true, I think, for quite a while. We can do a great job of figuring out what test suites we need and which test suites we need, and which tests we need in those test suites, and then build great, efficient, effective frameworks to execute them. But if we don't have stable environments and data, it's not going to matter, right? And a very common phrase that we hear when this is going on is, well, it worked on my machine, right? And when you've got a test failing and the automation engineer says, well, it worked on my machine, typically it's environment or data issues that are the culprit here. So over the next few slides, we're going to be talking about what we can do to remove that phrase from our testing vernacular. All right, let's take a look, start with test environments and take a look at the spectrum of test environments and data situations that we might encounter. At one end of the spectrum, we have the good old static shared environments that are created and seem to persist forever. I still see a lot of organizations implementing DevOps processes or trying to that are still working in this environment. I've added stale to that because I think by their nature, the data in these environments often becomes very stale over time. This environment often causes a cascading set of issues because they're shared. That causes instability in the data. Maybe someone changes data that is needed by someone else for some testing purpose. And depending on the approach to managing that data, and very often there isn't one, the data is probably stale. Also have scheduling conflicts. We maybe have user acceptance tests trying to do their work, but we also need to run a load test, and maybe some other department needs to use it because their environment is in even worse shape. It's probably not very production-like, not in size or shape, but also maybe no one is ever quite sure of what the exact configuration of the environment is. Again, leading to a long analysis cycle if things go wrong. And those issues are the root cause of many of the automation challenges we referred to earlier. Data instability results in unreliable execution. Because we can't rely on the data, we might be forced to set up all our data each time we want to execute the test, and that can really work against our need for fast feedback. Data or configuration issues can result in false positives, or again, worse, false negatives. And all that data, right, or all those issues, I should say, result in ridiculously long time for analysis, because we're not really sure if those issues are actually issues, and if they are, what caused them. So let's take a look at the other end of the environment data spectrum, where we have dynamic, dedicated, fresh environments. They're dynamic, so we can create them on demand using virtualization and infrastructure as code technologies. Because they're easier to create and manage, we can likely have more of them and dedicate them to specific functions and eliminate all the issues associated with sharing those environments. For the same reasons, we can make them production-like if we want, or at least be in a state where everyone is working in separate but identically configured environments, right? Going a long way to removing the "well, it worked on my machine" issue. And since we're creating the environments on demand, we might as well ensure that it has the data we need in the state that we need it to be in. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that we're going to snap our fingers and automatically be at the far right end of this spectrum. We have dynamic, dedicated, fresh environments. There's a lot of realities that certainly would prevent us from doing that. But we should endeavor to move as far as we can toward that. And again, that should be part of your continuous improvement efforts. And not only will this improve your automation, but your entire delivery cycle. This will create a solid foundation for that. So again, a lot of realities associated with achieving this ideal, or preventing us from achieving this ideal. But based on your certain situation, your environment, you should really look long and hard to see what you can do to continuously improve and move to the right here. So moving on specifically to test data, and I'm sure we can all relate stories of testing issues we've encountered that were somehow related back to data. Again, if we look at the World Quality Report, the biggest data-related challenges were first keeping data in sync with tests. And this is probably the biggest one, right? With a situation where we have tests that are inputting data that's no longer appropriate, given the current state of the application, or maybe the test is expecting a data response that is different from what the system is giving us. Next is a lack of data for complex integration testing. And these are tests that are typically further down the pipeline, maybe some end-to-end flows or some regression test flows. And finally, I think very similar to the second is maintaining consistent data across systems under test. And to me, this speaks more to data in external services or other systems that make up some type of end-to-end business flow. But really, independent of the specific challenge, it all goes back to the inability to reliably execute automated tests on demand. And again, that flies directly in the face of what we're trying to get from DevOps. So all this points to a need for a test data management strategy. And if you remember from the Test Suite Canvas slide, one of the sections talked specifically about data. And this is something we need to think about before we start building frameworks and tests, and certainly something that has to be done before we execute those tests. So as we think about our test suites and subsequently the tests that we're going to add to them, we really need to pay attention to the data that each of our potential tests may need, essentially our data requirements. It's very easy to just begin creating tests and probably subconsciously include the data, but we really need to understand what I call the dimensions of that data that really are the attributes of the data that describes how it lives and behaves in the application. First is the type of data. In most cases, this means is it structured or unstructured. But of course, the value of the data, and that may be a specific value required for a test, or just a class of values, maybe an order type or a product type or a user type that's required for the test. Time is extremely important. A lot of times when we have tests that pass for a period of time and they suddenly start failing, time turns out to be the culprit. Maybe the data expired, an insurance policy reached its expiration dates. Maybe it's something as simple as you've got a corporate policy that even in test environments, your test user credentials have to be updated. The passwords need to be changed over some period of time. The ability for data to be reused or not is important as well. For example, if I'm testing an e-commerce system, the account I'm using to purchase items can likely be reused over multiple tests. But if I'm testing shipping an order, I can likely only ship that specific order once. Volume of data is also important, and this almost always comes into play for load testing or other multi-user testing. You need a number of user accounts to spread across your concurrent users, but there's also some subtleties here. Maybe you need a specific data value that represents volume. Think about some level of inventory or maybe some level of available credit. And finally, where does the data live? If we're going to possibly develop a strategy to manage it, we need to understand where it's coming from so you can evaluate your options for controlling it. Who owns the environments? Who owns the data? What else is going on in those environments, so we understand what the limitations are that we might have to deal with. All right, let's talk a bit about test data management strategy. I wish there was a one-size-fits-all recipe for this, but there's not, right? It's going to vary quite a bit from organization to organization based on where the data lives, what the dimensions are, what type of test environments you have. Right? What even works for an e-commerce platform in one organization is probably not appropriate for a different organization implementing the exact same e-commerce platform. So it's better, I think, to talk about potential techniques that we can use to expand our tool belt, so when we're ready to dig into our own situations, we have more options. So and there are dozens, hundreds of different things we can do, and again, no two organizations are doing this exactly alike, and here are some high-level things that we can think about. At the application level, we've got the tried and true data refresh, essentially replacing the current data in your environment with data from a known state. A lot of organizations do this from production, which probably truly isn't a fully known state. This is a fairly common approach, but the way it's done, it typically doesn't work well in DevOps, right? That refresh cadence is too slow for what we need in a DevOps environment. Also doesn't work very well for integrated systems that can't easily be refreshed all at the same time in sync. Next is data partitioning. And this is more common. This is where we dedicate certain data objects for use by the automated test suites, maybe certain accounts or warehouses, et cetera, that are named specifically and identified to be used by a specific test in a specific test suite. Certainly helps with issues that are related to test environments. A common technique here is to use this in conjunction with a data refresh, maybe putting data that is test data out in production. It's not visible or used by the production users, but when that refresh happens, that test data comes along for the ride. You can also dedicate entire environments to automation. Again, this depends quite a bit on a number of factors like complexity and cost. And these can all be effective, but again, may not be flexible and nimble enough for our DevOps needs. So let's talk about some things we can do at the test suite level that may lend themselves a little bit better. First, we can have our tests create the data they need prior to execution. Again, this is often created with data partitioning to further lessen the chance of data-related issues. For example, a test might create some inventory, but the SKU and the inventory location are designated for a specific automated test only. Similarly, we can have tests clean up after themselves, and this is typically done in conjunction with pre-test data creation. But we have to be careful, right? If we spend 3 hours of data setup for 20 minutes of testing, we probably need to find a more efficient way. Again, we want fast feedback. And this is similar to having dedicated automation environments, but with the added twist that we're creating test environment in the state we need it when we need it, and then we can maybe blow it away when we're done. Finally, we can build capabilities into our frameworks, and I see this very commonly as well, that handle data changes over time, or follow some rules that make it impossible to use the same data for each execution. So essentially, have your tests not have static data in them, but rather placeholders that say, okay, here's the current policy number I'm using, or here's the policy number that I need for this execution, but the actual policy number is kept external to the test suite and changed in one central location versus in all the different tests that might need it. Of course, we have full-blown test management solutions that were purpose-built for managing data in test environments. Techniques like mocking and service virtualization that can address situations where we need to test our code against dependencies that maybe aren't ready yet, or that we don't have control over the data. I think the important takeaway here, though, is to understand that test data management is absolutely important to test automation, and that we develop a decent tool belt of techniques that we can use to address it. And it's extremely important that we really understand the application, its data, and the environments that we're working in before we begin to discern what is appropriate for us. Again, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So before we take some questions, let's talk about some key takeaways. So if you got nothing out of the past 35, 40 minutes or so, what should you take away? Well, first, effective test automation is absolutely required to achieve success in DevOps. Testing is absolutely going to be the bottleneck if you don't get this right. A big step forward towards that is creating the right test suites. So understanding what test suites are appropriate, and of course, creating the right tests within them. Right? We want enough tests to give us the risk assessment that we need, and no more, because any additional tests that aren't adding value are just extending our feedback loop. Ensure, as we just talked about, ensure we understand our test environment and data requirements, and we have a strategy to manage them. And the earlier that we involve the organization in that process, in understanding that, the better. If we wait until we're executing tests and we're seeing failures due to data issues, you've got a lot of work ahead of yourself. Finally, continuously improve. Again, I can't say it enough. Automated test suites very often tend to be fire and forget solutions, where even if you do have a technical backlog and a culture of continuous improvement that improves the way you deliver your software, the automated test suites often get left out of that. So please remember to apply those same concepts to these efforts as well. And lastly, and maybe to everyone's surprise, we didn't talk about specific tools. And that's because tools are really the enablers of our test automation approach. Very often, one of the issues that I see is test automation is a tool or framework first discussion. And you're worried about choosing a tool or what framework or approach you're going to use, and all those other things that we just talked about are secondary. But the reality is, the things we just talked about are the foundation, and the tools, as long as they support the technology of your application and meet your requirements, they're not the first point to discuss. They're point 5 or 6 perhaps. So it's very important to remember. So let's move on to see if you have any questions. If there's any future discussion or questions that pop up, you're always welcome to contact me in any one of those means there shown on the screen. And I will then ask Magdi if there's any questions that were submitted.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you so much for the wonderful information we received here. Question from Akash says, any recommendation on testing tools for DevOps? I think you addressed this to a certain extent.
So Well, I can talk briefly. So the tools themselves are, again, are less important. So when people start to think about test automation, let's say they have a web or mobile app, Selenium comes into to the discussion. But really, if it supports your application, your technology environments, the tool is less important, right? They all can be integrated easily with continuous integration servers and pipelines. They can be integrated with other things that are common in DevOps in terms of gathering results and analyzing results and displaying them and in dashboards and such. So I think the tool is less important. I would say that, again, don't let whatever tool you decide on first to be your hammer. You should still be doing unit testing, right? So, and unit testing is typically at the code level, done by the developers. They're not using Selenium. Some organizations now are doing unit testing of performance, so there's some actual frameworks built around that to make that easier. There's API-specific libraries and tools that are purpose-built for testing services and APIs. So my best advice is to make sure you're getting a tool that is fits your specific testing need and supports your technologies. After that, right, it's all these other things we just talked about that are providing the foundation for that tool to be successful.
All right. I have another question. Anantha, could you please just clarify your question here while we are trying to answer other questions? Give us some clarification here on your question. Question from Akash again. Any comments on DevSecOps? Because security testing sometimes is getting very important. DevSecOps.
So I will start by saying that's not my area of expertise, but in terms of your testing and checking activities, yes, there are tools and techniques for testing that. I see my counterparts who are experts in security. They put a lot of focus in early in the development process and cycle on building security into the application rather than testing it and checking it in at the end. So in DevOps, again, from the organizations that I see are being more successful from this standpoint, they're doing a lot up front to build security in, and that's getting your security experts involved earlier in the design and architecture phases. But I see a lot of pipelines that do have security level testing built in at some point.
All right, a question came from Anantha. How is this approach and the process you're explaining different from the automation approach and the processes without DevOps?
That's a great question. I would say it shouldn't be different. The problem is that organizations that haven't used this approach, and this isn't rocket science, obviously, this is just essentially addressing common obstacles, getting the foundational components in place first. But back in the waterfall days, right, we had longer release cycles and we had time to either address or, unfortunately, more often mask these issues, right? Because while the system was being built, before we had to run our regression test, we had time to address issues. But if we are now kicking these tests off maybe every day, maybe multiple times a day, based on application changes, there's just no way that we can have all these issues in place and expect to get any value out of automation. So it doesn't, I wouldn't recommend anything different out of DevOps, but the importance of taking care of these issues and this process is absolutely required in DevOps.
All right, there is another question about the future of DevOps for the next 10 years or more for those of us who just beginners in the field.
So I would point to some of the experts who are thinking about this every day. You know, my focus is more from how can I help organizations make sure that they're not leaving quality and testing activities behind as they transition to DevOps. But folks like Gene Kim, Dave Farley, John Willis, they all contributed, I believe, all to the DevOps handbook. The Phoenix Project, if you've read about that, the continuous delivery book, a lot of those contributed there. I follow them on Twitter and other areas. They are blogging about this stuff continuously and talking about it continuously, and I think they have a better vision into kind of the future of DevOps than I can possibly provide.
All right, Vivian is asking about any suggestions for reading research on how to help transform a totally very manual QA organization to DevOps automated culture.
So, well, I think if we're talking about testing and DevOps together, right? So you're not going to drive a DevOps transformation just by looking at testing and test automation, but assuming that that's all happening together, I recommend a book called Testing in DevOps by Katrina Clokey. It does a real good job of not just thinking about test automation, but testing throughout the pipeline, even into production. And there's just tons of good references and sources in there that you can dig into to learn a lot about what it means to be successful in testing and in general, and of course automation in DevOps. I think the continuous delivery book, which is considered kind of the Bible for DevOps software delivery in terms of how that works, is a good read. That is by I believe that's by Dave Farley. Let me just check real quick. Yeah, Dave Farley and Jez Humble. And Jez Humble is another good person to follow in terms of their vision around DevOps.
All right, Jennifer is asking if you have any good resource on how to develop good testing environment.
So I would actually, I'd point her to the continuous delivery book and also the DevOps handbook in terms of describing the attributes that are required for a good test environment in DevOps. And what we're essentially endeavoring for is, you know, complete understanding and control over the configuration of our environments. So we can create them very quickly and efficiently, and we can eliminate differences in our environments as the cause for issues that we're seeing. And there's a lot of good information in both of those books around those areas.
All right. Good question from Shamas. For maintainability and flexibility, can you speak to the importance of the concept of DRY, don't repeat yourself, DRY?
So, so in terms of test creation, well, yeah, certainly. I see a lot of test suites that are filled with test cases that do repeat themselves. A good example of that might be a bunch of UI tests that go over the same parts of the applications to test the combinations and permutations of business logic that have nothing to do with the UI layer. and now they not only have they repeated themselves in terms of the actions that they're executing against the user interface, they've also created a test suite of very slow, more unreliable tests because of that. So the technique to address that is focus some tests on the mechanics of the user interface, making sure that they're getting the information and displaying it correctly in all the different ways that it can. But when you're testing your business logic, there's really no reason, assuming you have another approach, there's no reason to repeat yourself, repeat those actions at the user interface level.
Right, we have a kind of a basic question. What is the basic difference between DevOps and automation?
Well, I think DevOps is a culture, and I couldn't possibly do a better job of explaining it than they do in the DevOps handbook. But automation is a key principle to DevOps, and not just automation of testing, right? Automation of builds and deployments, and of course testing, right? That's kind of the foundation, at least from a technology perspective of DevOps. Can automated testing benefit software development outside of DevOps? Absolutely. But it is absolutely key to being successful with DevOps, because if we don't automate our tests, as you can imagine, as the software goes down the pipeline, if all the testing we need to do is manual, we've just built in bottlenecks, right? And the other principles that the developers are using in terms of short feature branches and commit small batches of code, and then if they don't have those automated checks in place to make sure, right, that those changes have not caused any issues, everything's going to slow down, right? So yeah, they might be able to get a feature out there quickly, but then getting the feedback on what those changes actually did to the code is going to be extremely slow. So you risk making a bunch of changes without any feedback to what the previous changes have done. So certainly critical to DevOps. Automation of the testing is critical to DevOps, but DevOps itself, I think, is from a technology perspective, automation is kind of woven through the entire process.
Right. The same kind of question keeps coming back again. What can you give as far as help to beginners in the field?
Well, specific to test automation in DevOps, I would say realize that test automation is not a tool. I know I've said that a handful of times, but very common, especially with beginners, right? If I am going to ask them, well, what is test automation? And their answer might be a tool, right? What do you think of when I say test automation? And very often the first thing that comes to mind is a tool. And that leads them to researching, okay, how do I implement this tool? And how do I build a framework around this tool? And that's all important at some point. But if you realize that the garbage in, garbage out principle applies, if I haven't done a good job of understanding what my tests should be in the first place before I start to apply automation principles to them, it's not going to matter. If I haven't controlled my test environments and my test data so those tests can execute, have a stable foundation to execute against, it's not going to matter. So focus your research on the principles of test automation. And certainly in parallel, if you want to look at what capabilities tools have and what framework approaches are out there, I think that's just fine. But if you educate yourself in parallel on the principles and common issues and those the non-technical pieces of it, I think as you learn about those tools, you'll be able to ask the right questions. Okay, how can I best address this issue with this tool? or maybe I can't. Maybe it's a fundamental kind of foundational thing I have to create in my environment for the tool to be successful. So that would be my best advice to beginners is just not dive in deep on the tools first. Understand some of the issues and the principles that are required to be successful that we just talked about, and certainly be aware of the common obstacles that we talked about.
All right, I think there's only one question left, but it looks like it might take time to answer. So I'm going to pass this question to Lee to answer directly to the person who asked it.
Absolutely.
I'd like to close the webinar by thanking everyone for being in the webinar, and thanks again to Lee for sharing his information. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available at the Testing Institute website next week. Also, within an hour from now, you will be receiving a short survey about this webinar. We really appreciate you take a few minutes to fill out the survey for the purpose of our continuous improvement. Again, thanks to everyone, and hopefully we'll see you in future webinars by International Institute for Software Testing. Thank you all.
Yep. Thank you, Maggie, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.